Hello, everyone, and welcome to our JBF webinar, webcast, food industry webinars, whatever you want to call it. This particular webinar is focused on food producers in the pandemic, but before we get to that, I wanted to share a few other things that are happening in the James Beard Foundation realm. So always, you can visit jamesbeard.org for more information on what we're doing. Just today, we released a reopening guide, which has been really great. It's called Safety First, Serving Food and Protecting People During COVID-19. It is free. It is available as a PDF. The Beard Foundation worked on it with the Aspen Institute, World Central Kitchen, Off Their Plate, and it was co-written. It was written by Corby Kummer from The Atlantic with a lot of input from some CDC veterans. So it's a really great reopening resource. Again, totally free. Check it out on the James Beard site. Next week's webinars will focus on reopening. So we know that a lot of folks have had questions about reopening. Next week is when we're going to be focusing on it here in these webinars. Those will be available to register for, and more information on those webinars will be available tomorrow. So if you want to learn about those, all of that is available also on our site, jamesbeard.org/industry/support/webinars, or you can just Google James Beard Industry Webinars and that'll help you find it as well. So check back there. Our webinar today, Food Producers in the Pandemic, will be recorded. So if you want to review any of this, if your Wi-Fi drops out or you want to send it to a friend, all of this will also be on that industry webinars page, as well as all of our past webinars that we've recorded. So feel free to reference that at any time if you need to. So let's get started. So my name is Ashley Kosiak. I'm an Impact Program Manager at the James Beard Foundation. And before we get to our guest today, Eric Diebel, I want to take you through a few kind of technical points around the webinars. Again, this is being recorded. A link will be available on the Beard Foundation site after the webinar is over. We'll tend to save our questions for the end, but not always. We will take some breaks. But if you do have any questions for Eric, if you look at your screen, you'll notice on the right-hand side of the screen, there's like a little question mark. You can click on that and you can send any questions that you have to me, and then we'll kind of moderate those with Eric throughout the webinar. You can also use that question function if you are running into any technical difficulties. My colleague Elk is on this webinar as well, and she'll be monitoring that so that if you do have any technical difficulties come up, we will do our best to help you out. Unfortunately, we are not GoToWebinar staff, so there's limitations as to what we are able to do and help with, but we will absolutely do our best to assist you if you do run into any technical issues. And again, a recording of this webinar will be available in the next day or so. So, enough of that housekeeping stuff, that's out of the way. I want to introduce Eric Diebel from the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, or NSAC. So he's the policy director there. NSAC is an alliance of 130 grassroots organizations that advocates for federal policy to advance the sustainability of agriculture, food systems, natural resources, and rural communities. So Eric, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Ashley. It is my pleasure to join you today, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to everybody on this webinar. And I'm extraordinarily grateful to have the opportunity, and even more so, grateful for everyone who's on the call that's engaged in advocating for a better food system.
Great. Well, to kick us off, if you could tell me a little bit about what it means to be the policy director of the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, and also talk a little bit about the sort of work that you were doing, let's say in December of 2019, before the pandemic kind of upended things for a lot of people.
Sure. So I joined NSAC back in January, which is an interesting time to transition into a new role right before the coronavirus pandemic sort of took full hold. And prior to that, I was the senior policy advisor for Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, the junior senator from New York, where I covered her ag, nutrition, and arts policy. I'm also a large animal veterinarian, so I actually come to agricultural policy sort of through the back end of a dairy cow, and that's how I sort of got my familiarity with agricultural production systems, was from the farmer side of things. As a policy director at NSAC, I spend a lot of time shepherding about a dozen of our staff who work on policy issues to help craft better, more equitable, more just, more fair federal policy that spans the entire gamut of the agriculture production system. So NSAC looks at everything from research that informs conservation practices in sort of the strictly research and academic space, all the way up through how do we facilitate markets for direct market farmers by enhancing supports for farmers markets and direct market opportunities. There's also a strong commitment within the institution around equity at every level of the value chain, and that includes farmers, farm workers, and food system workers, all the way up through the restaurant and retail trade as well.
Great. And so how has, since you came on in January, which was, I think when things were maybe starting to shift a little bit, but certainly I don't think anyone really, I certainly didn't know what was on the horizon. How has that shifted for you, the sort of work that you're doing?
It's been dramatic, because it's been dramatic for the farmers and food system folks that we are most closely associated with. So ordinarily, NSAC is going to be doing things like trying to improve conservation programs and writing responses to rules that are issued by USDA or another federal agency. And this has really caused us to become, at least for a time, a very different organization, one built around emergency response. And I think that's reflective of what's happened across a lot of nonprofit organizations and a lot of folks that have been generally concentrated on policy. We started to see very early on in the outbreak real significant impacts for farmers and farm workers. Like I said in the beginning, a lot of the folks that we work with most closely are direct market farmers. And I guess it's important to point out to folks on the webinar, there are two value chains in our country. There's one that's primarily built around the retail sale of foods, and another one that is direct market, and those are sales to restaurants, sales to institutions, sales to schools, sales directly between farmers and consumers, and that's about a 50-50 split. And so we tend to work more with the folks over on the direct market side, not exclusively, though. And all of the things that keep you safe or help limit the damage of a pandemic, things like social distancing, closing markets, closing schools, closing restaurants, are the exact things that cause markets to disappear overnight for those direct market farmers. So it was incredibly disruptive. And so we went from being more concerned with long-term policy objectives. How do we help farmers fight climate change? How do we make sure that we incentivize good practices and just and equitable distribution of food and resources? To how can we keep our farmers in business long enough to sort of get through the initial transition of the pandemic, but then also beyond?
Right. I feel like, especially a couple of weeks ago, if you were reading the news, you probably saw it was a big headline, things about farmers dumping milk, tilling crops in it because no one wanted this really beautiful looking produce. Could you talk a little bit? I know you were talking about that, in the different supply chains, but what else is happening that maybe we aren't seeing if we live in a city, if we don't live or work on a farm or in a rural community or a rural area, beyond those headlines of, milk dumped and so on and so forth?
Yeah, so it's been interesting because the impact on farmers and farm communities has been really different depending on what people grow and where people grow it. So farmers that are in the southern portions of the United States that had produce that was ready to come out of the ground, those are the folks that have been most immediately affected, because if you were selling into a direct market, and now suddenly you're trying to repurpose your goods for a retail sale, you may not have the bagging or processing capacity to get that product into the right market. You also probably don't have the right relationships. You know, you're not part of that value channel, and so trying to get into that value channel in the period of this enormous disruption is very difficult. For other farmers that are in more northern latitudes, this has really changed like what they're going to be planting and how they're going to sort of build out the rest of their year. Because you have to think, you know, folks in New England right now are planting, and you know, people in the upper Midwest are out in their fields right now, and they have to come to some idea about what do I put in the ground when I don't know what my market's going to look like in 3, 4, 5, 6 months. And so there's been a lot of disruption on the sort of larger scale producers. Some of the smaller scale producers and some of the folks that are really drilled down on direct markets, some of them have been able to pivot pretty effectively, and you may have seen stories about that. Farmers that are having enormous success with CSAs, you know, in transitioning like maybe away from a farmer's market or to maybe now a socially distanced farmer's market. Some of those folks are having a lot of success, but it's not everyone. You have to be a farmer that's sort of set up well to succeed in this new environment. You need the resources and the technical capacity to maybe shift to an online platform, or you have to be close enough to a major metropolitan city in order to still have folks willing to come out to your farm to pick up things or to have the ability to move your product into a denser urban core. And so it's been really different depending on where you are, what you grow, and how close you are to an alternative market system.
Are you seeing any other, you know, kind of ways the farmers are responding? So you mentioned CSAs. You know, I've seen a lot of online, kind of, you know, online sales direct from farmers these days, at least in around where I am in Minnesota right now. But something like that, or are some of these farms, are they able to change the relationships that they have? You know, whereas before I might have provided, you know, product to a school or something like that. Are they able to build those relationships with, you know, with the grocery stores or whoever else they might need to?
It's been really challenging for them to do that. There have been some grocery stores that have really doubled down and tried hard to find the farmers in their areas and to begin more direct local procurement. But generally, those folks have struggled. And you've got to consider sort of the average age of a farmer in the United States is pretty advanced. I think it's about 58.5 years of age right now. Many folks live in rural areas which don't have the best broadband connections. And so asking a farmer who might be the best farmer in the world to suddenly become a really sophisticated online marketer while all of these other things are going on in their lives is going to be a real challenge for them. Part of the federal policy response to the coronavirus pandemic in the agricultural space has been about trying to figure out a way to buy that produce from those farmers and put it into a place where there's a lot of need, places like emergency food systems and food banks and food pantries in communities, and to make sure that a farmer that might have sold to a school will still have some sort of market, and that those kids who are no longer in school will still have access to the food that would have come out of that school cafeteria. And so there's been a lot of repurposing and a lot of really great work. You know, there are folks that are doing wonderful work. It's been imperfect though. And so the results have been pretty mixed across the country.
So I definitely want to talk about policy because there's been a lot of policy happen. But before we kind of pivot to that, I have one question. It's kind of an unfair question of me to ask because you're very much focused on the US supply chain. But is this something that farms and farmers are seeing really around the world as far as you know? Is the European food supply chain experiencing similar disruptions, you know, that you're seeing? And is there something we could learn from, or is this kind of a problem everybody's in together right now?
Everybody has the same problems, but the capacity to respond to the problem is very different in very different countries. So in places like the European Union, where there are more effective measures and tools to compensate farmers for losses built around sort of how their agricultural policy works, it is perhaps a bit easier for them to target aid to farmers who've been affected than it is in the United States. In other parts of the world, it's dramatically different. And we're seeing really just terrible suffering by a lot of farmers who are in developing countries or in low resource communities in developed countries, because they do not have effective either government sort of government interventions or local and regional food systems that they can rely on to sort of help them through this time. And if you're a farmer who doesn't have a lot of resources, the longer this goes on, the more dire your situation becomes. And so while we deal strictly with federal policy, a lot of the folks that we work with have broader engagement and may be involved in international agriculture policy.
Great. So yeah, let's talk about policy. So to date, you know, and if you've been following these webinars, if you're in the audience, we've done, you know, some more high level policy overviews, not a lot of focus on agriculture. So you might have heard, you know, since March, there's been, I think, 5 packages: preparedness and response, families and workers, CARES, the Paycheck Protection Program, and healthcare enhancement, which was like a re-up on the PPP. So that's what's happened so far. How does, you know, what's been enacted so far, how has that impacted, you know, the US farmers that you work with?
Right. So you're right. We're up to C4, but we had a C3.5 package in there. So the House just released essentially the 5th emergency response bill yesterday, or I guess the day before. All the days sort of blend together. But generally, the aid that has been made available to farmers and other folks in the value system has been pretty non-specific. So in the 3rd package, which we call C3, there was a large amount of money made available, about $16.5 billion available for farmers. And it was broken up into 2 different sections. And this is all part of a program called CFAP, which was the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. One component, about $3 billion, was the creation of food boxes, which is a favorite program of the Secretary Perdue. And some of you who are involved in federal policy may have seen food boxes before in different contexts. Those $3 billion were made available for farmers to sell in a variety of different products. That included dairy, some ready-to-eat meats, and a lot of fruits and vegetables. And so that program is being implemented. They just made the award announcement of the awards available last week. So we're getting a sense of who's going to be able to provide food to emergency food organizations. So that's all going to go to food banks and food pantries. About 16.5 additional $1 billion is available for direct payments to farmers. And we don't know what that looks like yet. We're still waiting on that rule to come out. And we expect, we do know a few things about it. We know that the program is going to pay farmers for their actual losses. So farmers are going to have to demonstrate how much they lost. And so far, the program is going to compensate farmers for 85% of their losses in the first quarter, 35% of losses in the second quarter. Folks that are going to be eligible are livestock producers, specialty crop producers. Those are folks who are growing fruits and vegetables, and dairy producers. That's it. That's kind of all we know. So we've got concerns at NSAC around how will USDA target the most vulnerable producers? How will it ensure that there is money available for historically underserved farmers who may not be that plugged in to USDA programs? And we want to know how USDA is going to require documentation of loss, because that looks a lot different for different farmers. Say you're a corn and soybean farmer in the upper Midwest. Well, you can prove your losses pretty easily, because you've got 2 crops in the ground, both of which have a connection to the futures market. And all of that information is recorded at USDA Farm Service Agency offices. If you're a small direct market farmer who's selling in a farmer's market to a school and to a couple of restaurants in your community, and you're diversified fruit and vegetable grower, you may have 15 different crops that are sold 5 different ways. So how do those folks demonstrate the loss that they've incurred because they've lost all of those markets? And so there's a lot of unanswered questions that we at NSAC are trying to make sure get answered, and get answered in a way that works for every producer.
Could you talk a little bit more about the food box program? Just because I know on some other webinars we've done, some other policy discussions, there's been a lot of questions about that, curiosity of how exactly it works. But my understanding is it's essentially nonprofits partnered with farms. Is that correct?
There are nonprofits and for-profits in coordination with one another that bid on contracts from USDA to provide a variety of different types of boxes. Where those products come from is up to the folks that receive the bid. So there are some folks that will be buying exclusively from 1 or 2 farms, or some folks that will be buying from lots and lots of farms in their region. I know that there was a very interesting story this morning in the Washington Post about some of the folks who received some of those awards, particularly some of the largest awards that don't seem to have a great deal of history or experience in providing meals or working in complex food systems and food value chains. So it remains to be seen how effective that program is. And I think while I'm very glad that there is money going into a farmer's pocket at some point, I think there are a lot of folks that are concerned that maybe there are more effective ways of spending that money, perhaps providing it directly to farmers in combination with increasing SNAP benefits for individuals so that existing market structures stay intact and stay robust, rather than trying to create a completely alternative food delivery system.
Right. And so we talked about it briefly, but the latest piece of legislation that's up was just, kind of released in draft form 2 days ago on the 12th, which is Tuesday. Time does do strange things these days. The HEROES Act, it's over 1,800 pages, so it's nearly 2,000 pages. It's a lot of material, all of which, might not pass. It probably won't all pass. What are you looking at in there? What do you want to see make it through in there? What would you love to see? Any changes made to the HEROES Act? What do you want to see with that?
So there are some wonderful things in the HEROES Act. There are some real significant improvements and expansions of existing nutrition programs. There's a 15% increase to SNAP benefits. There's a cost waiver for the FDIPR, the Federal Distribution program that is in place in tribal lands. There's some pretty significant investments ranging from $5 to $50 million into a bunch of programs that help small diversified farmers. Those are things like LAMP, which is the farmers market promotion program, and the value added producer program. There's some additional money available for specialty crop research and a couple of things to help smooth out some of the bumpier aspects of the value chain. I think maybe even more importantly, there's pretty significant resources made available for hazard pay, for farm workers and food system workers who've been deemed essential. A lot of protections that would be extended if the House bill was enacted in its current form, and some pretty important provisions there about ensuring that they've got access to the appropriate personal protection equipment, which we know is a real problem. I think the biggest dollar sign is an additional $16.5 billion in direct relief to farmers. And that would extend beyond, how I said in the C3 package, that's just 85% in first quarter and 35% in Q2. This would make that same amount of money available in each quarter going forward. And while that's certainly welcome and warranted, there aren't a lot of guardrails around that program and not a lot of language about how it should be targeted to those folks most in need. And it also doesn't fully address the issue of documentation of losses. So while it's got a lot of really good things in it, there are still a couple of sort of things that we think could be better perhaps in a Senate package. There's also no ag credit reforms, which is going to be a real big problem because as the pandemic continues to drag on, farmers are going to run out of money. They're going to run out of money to plant. They're going to run out of money to harvest, hire workers. And when that happens, they're going to turn to USDA for loans and assistance, and some of them won't be eligible. So we're trying very hard to make sure that whatever does come out of Congress eventually has some credit components in there to keep those vulnerable producers going.
Right. I also feel like I've heard some things around something called the Prime Act, which really addresses, because all these food supply chains are a little bit different. And again, if you've been reading the news, the slaughterhouses have been particularly hard hit by the coronavirus, by COVID-19, and addressing that specific supply chain disruption between meat producers and ranchers and slaughterhouses. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and so that's a really interesting point, and NSAC has a long history of working with small and very small meat processing plants, because if you think about it, if you're a small farmer who maybe has 30 head of cattle, when you're moving those to market, it's going to be a challenge to feed it into a really huge, JBS or Cargill-owned plant. It's probably you're probably as a farmer going to be better served by a smaller slaughterhouse in your own community. And so NSAC has over the last 30 years worked to support that sort of critical infrastructure. What's happened is, with increasing consolidation and concentration in food systems, things have gotten incredibly efficient, but they've done so with great cost. And the cost has been to workers who are in these facilities. It's been to farmers who are no longer realizing the full value of their product because they don't have the same opportunity to sell to different places like they used to. And while this is efficient, it's ruthlessly so. And in this period of the pandemic, we've also realized that it's not very resilient. And so you've got folks that are unfortunately euthanizing thousands of animals, and as you said, dumping milk because they can't get through the existing supply chains because there's no slack, there's no redundancy, there's no resilience. And when all of the work that you do is to maximize the monetary efficiency of a food supply system, you do so at the expense of that redundant capacity that can help you out. And so all it takes is one plant in Iowa to close that processes 5% of the nation's pork before things fall apart for farmers and for food, processing workers and for consumers. As we're starting to see, price spikes at the retail level. We have enough food, right? We did not have fewer heads of cattle the day before the pandemic than the day after. So this is not a problem about growing food. It's about making sure that we can get it to the people who need it most. And we have not invested in that capacity in the way that we should as a nation. And the folks that we've permitted to integrate more and consolidate more of that value chain are struggling to meet the need. And I think that points to the need to have a different kind of food system, one built more around local and regional food systems, one where farmers are selling more directly to their customers and their consumers. And I think what you're seeing, not to move away from the Prime Act, I think what you're seeing now is things like Prime Act and other pieces of legislation that we expect, that we know that are being developed in the Senate right now, trying to figure out a way to address the disruption in the supply chain. The problem is they're just putting Band-Aids on a broken system, rather than doing the heavy work of saying, let's go to the Department of Justice and figure out where concentration and consolidation is hurting not just American consumers, but everybody in the value chain. And let's fix that, right? Let's not start over, but start to unpack what we have and build in some more resiliency. Rather than do that, most of the bills that we've seen are, again, different types of band-aids trying to put a patch on that system. And I think they're important, and some will almost certainly succeed in this next package. We don't exactly know which components will. Probably some support for overtime for small and very small plants, some additional safeguards for food system workers. These are elements that we would like to see come forward, but it does not fix the fundamental structural problems that we have in the food system.
So if you and NSAC were given a magic wand to, kind of enact whatever sort of policy you needed to, make any changes that you felt needed to happen, and it was just going to happen across the country, to make it so that if another global incident like this were to happen again, so that the food supply chain and food system would be more secure and would be more resilient along the way, what would you do? And you can be broad or specific or whatever you think.
This may surprise some folks, but I think the most significant thing that we could do would be go back and revisit a particular piece of authorship by Bork during the Reagan era that defined consumer price as the only measure by which an antitrust enforcement could be undertaken. I think that doesn't sound very much like agriculture, and it isn't, but I think it's at the heart of the problem, and that is the excessive consolidation and concentration in a lot of our farming system. Concentration doesn't help anyone other than the companies that are effective at concentrating the markets. It may bring down prices at the consumer level, and that's a good thing, but generally the people who lose out are everybody else in that value chain. So our farmers are making less than they ever have. We are in year number 6 of declining farm incomes. Spot prices in markets for grain futures and every single protein category are way down. And I don't think anybody who's reading stories about what it's like to be to work in a slaughter plant sees that work as what it should be. And I think maybe looking at our food system in a more holistic manner, making sure that we're not letting companies externalize their costs and really paying for what they're doing would be important in making a more just and equitable food system. And I think the key to doing that is robust antitrust enforcement.
And if there was one or two things, let's say one or two things that you wish that the average consumer took with them in their mind whenever they went to a grocery store or bought from a CSA or just made any sort of purchasing decision, what would that be? What would you wish that more just commonplace folks who don't live on farms or in rural communities took with them when they made purchases?
Yeah, I think the most important thing that people can do is to buy local when they can. They shouldn't feel bad about it if they can't. Not every community has, access to abundant, healthy foods at an affordable price, and I think there's probably a lot of work that we can do there. But folks should recognize every time they buy from a farmer directly, or from an organization of farmers, or from a company that aggregates farm goods within a local or regional sort of food shed, that farmer is going to earn more. They're going to be in a better position economically. They're going to be able to farm more sustainably, and the value of that food dollar stays in your own community. And so don't look at that as inefficient. look at that as a maximally sustainable type of agriculture. If you don't know the name of the person who produced your cucumber, that's okay, right? You can feel bad about it. But if there is a chance that you could buy that cucumber from a local farmer, that's an incredibly important thing to do.
Now we have a lot of chefs, caterers, culinary professionals, writers, all across that, all across that great culinary world on this webinar right now. What should they know, and also what can they do to support the local farmers and growers in their areas?
Yeah. So this will pass eventually. And, I've been talking a lot about farmers and farm workers today, and that's because that's generally the folks that NSAC and NSAC coalition members serve. That is not to dismiss or just diminish the impact that the coronavirus pandemic has had on the rest of the food system. And, our heart goes out to restaurateurs and folks that are, that also saw their opportunities and their markets evaporate overnight. I think the thing to keep in mind is that this will change, this will pass. And when it does, I hope that we carry with us the understanding of just how bad our food production system got. It's not terrible, it's just wildly out of balance. And so if you have the opportunity to buy from a local producer or a local aggregator of produce for a couple cents more per bushel than maybe somebody who is part of a larger aggregated system. Or maybe if you choose when you're putting together menus to concentrate on things that are in season and available locally rather than having to have produce shipped halfway around the world. Every time you do that, every time you purchase with intention, every time you plan with intention, every time you think about the ground that produce or those products or that steer, every time you think about where that's coming from, that's going to make something better for a farmer. And honestly, if you're buying locally or within your own region, it's going to make things better for everybody in your community. I'm not a restaurateur. I understand that not everybody has unlimited money, and there are all sorts of decisions that go into purchasing and procurement and planning. But if I could tell anybody listening just one thing, is that remember how bad things are right now. And remember that on the other side of this, what you choose to do, how you choose to act, procure, plan, and purchase can make things better. I encourage everybody to do so. And I'm really grateful for the fact that so many chefs and restaurateurs and caterers have already chosen that path, and that so many folks have stayed engaged at the federal policy level. Not everyone, but lots of folks, have advocated within their state, or I've had a lot of chefs come down and visit me during my time in DC to advocate on federal policy issues, and that is also a very valuable thing to do.
So as we kind of start to transition to the question period, I would encourage everyone, if you do have a question for Eric, like I said, use that question mark function that you see just on the right side of your screen there. We have had a few come in. So one is about urban farms. I don't know how much work NSAC does with urban farms, with smaller, farms near cities, but how has this impacted them? Because I know I've been, speaking a lot about rural communities, but there are certainly urban farms and urban farmers as well.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And NSAC is very engaged in urban agriculture and peri-urban farming. And it's been interesting because in states or in cities and states where markets are still operating, perhaps with some additional social distancing mechanisms in place, those farmers are doing okay. If they are serving low-income communities or mixed-income communities, it may be a little bit more challenging for them because there are folks that are out of work, and finding dollars to purchase foods produced locally is challenging. So it's a bit of a mixed bag there. One of the interesting things is for those farmers who have experienced losses that are urban or peri-urban farmers, very few of them have any interaction with USDA. These are growers who aren't typically tied into crop insurance systems. They're not generally growing commodities and receiving commodity-specific payments. They're often not using USDA disaster assistance programs when a big storm blows through. So because these folks aren't well connected to USDA historically, it's going to be really difficult for USDA to reach them. They don't know who they are, right? So it's going to be hard for USDA to find them and then to help them figure out how to account for their losses and then to make a payment for which they really should be eligible. So again, just like for other types of farmers, it's been a bit of a mixed bag depending on where you are.
And I think this is something that we talked about briefly, but just because I think there's some question around it, if you could just revisit briefly what exactly CFAP is and what farmers it generally applies to and what farmers it generally works with.
Right. Sorry, I live in a universe in which this is like the #1 issue for everyone, so I apologize. So the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program is what USDA built out of the C3 package that came out of the Congress and was signed by the president. And so it is split down the middle. Well, not really. It's split $3 billion on one side and about $16.5 billion on the other side. And those $3 billion go towards the food box program, which is nonprofits partnered with for-profits buying produce, ready-to-eat meat, dairy, and cheese products, packing them into boxes, and then making those boxes available to emergency food organizations in the community or in the region. So that's one component of it. So that's one place that a farmer may receive some assistance by selling into that system. The other half, the 16.5 billion, larger portion of it is direct aid. And I'll give you an example of, say, 2 different farmers and what it looks like. If you are a cattle farmer who has a large operation out in, pick a big Midwestern state, the loss of value that happened during the first quarter of the year, as measured on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, times the number of head that you have in your herd is your loss for Q1. And USDA intends to write you a check for 85% of that lost value. Now, for somebody who is, like I said, a diversified grower, lots of different products, lots of different markets, maybe not that tied into USDA's traditional support systems, that program is going to look a lot different to you. You may not know where to go to access it. You may not know what forms you need in order to demonstrate loss, and you might not have incurred all of your losses in the first quarter. Maybe as you're planting a little later in the season, it's going to affect what you do in the future, which can be very costly. And say you already had some produce in the ground, and you decided you're going to switch to an online mechanism and start using CSA boxes at a drop location. The USDA compensation program, the direct farmer payment program, doesn't account for that as a loss. So the additional costs that you've incurred for transportation, repackaging, and an online platform, farmers won't be paid for that.
Right. So another attendee would like to know, you mentioned a Washington Post article about the produce boxes. They've asked if we can share that out with everyone. Would you happen to know the name of that article or approximately when it was?
As soon as I said it, I realized that it actually wasn't Washington Post. It was in Politico this morning. So I apologize. I got the news source wrong. I think it was Helena Butmiller-Evich's story this morning. But I will try to track that down for you and make a link available to you.
Yeah, so Mike will find that, and we'll try to circulate that. But I certainly have your email, and at the very least we can find it to you, and I might try to find it as you answer this next question that we have from Liz. So local and regional mills are working overtime to meet needs of consumers who can't find flour grains on their grocery store shelves. I can attest to that. I've seen a lot of empty grocery stores and some restaurants carrying, like selling their flour and grain. Can you speak to the opportunity presented by the pandemic to build sustainable regional grain-based food system?
Absolutely. And it's interesting. If you have mothballed excess capacity or underutilized existing assets, aka you've got some millstones that are only processing a few days a week rather than 7 days a week, now is a time of incredible opportunity for you because there is a lot of local and regional demand. And we've seen dramatic shifts in consumer purchasing behavior as people start to stress bake and eat at home and buy a lot of different types of products than maybe they were previously. So there are some really great opportunities. And the thing that's heartening is most of those, it's not like somebody is just starting up a grain mill to respond to this pandemic. They've been in operation, so we know that they've got some degree of sustainability and some sort of cost structure and market access that helps make that business viable. What we need to do is make sure that local grain farmers can, that they have relationships with those mills, and that after all of this has come to pass, that consumers who are buying from those mills that are within their region continue to do so. So things like, making sure that consumers understand who's providing for them in this really dramatically disrupted time, and giving them, giving consumers the opportunity to realize that, okay, for a few cents more, I support somebody in my community and make sure that if this ever happens again, I can still get all the flour that I need to, have a stress baking sourdough starter. So.
I think there are a lot of those right now. So I just shared, I think with the article you're talking about, multi-million-dollar food bank delivery contract. Contracts go to firms with little experience. So that was in Politico, and I just shared that out in the chat. So everybody should have that. So Mike, you'll have that link. So Jennifer wants to know, how can we, those displaced workers, help you, NSAC, with your mission to improve, create these new systems and policies?
It depends on what you're doing. So, and this is a challenge, it's a challenging question to answer. At sort of like a personal level, again, buying with intention when you can is a pretty meaningful act. Being engaged in local farmer assistance organizations is another way that people can plug in. On sort of a bigger, more political action, and again, that's what NSAC does. It's a federal an organization that's focused on federal policy. But calling folks in your state legislature and asking them how they are trying to meet the needs of local and regional food producers, asking them what they're using their departments of agriculture to do and who they're choosing to support can be a really meaningful thing. And writing an email to a Hill staffer right now can be a really important act. The House has, introduced their bill, but we expect 2 to 3 more weeks before the Senate is able to put together a package to respond to the House bill. And if you have a relationship with your senator, or you're part of an organization that can sort of help you lift up your voice, now is a great time to do that and to weigh in over on the Senate side about, the things that you want to see, about how you want a food system to look like. And it's challenging because, I think the person who put the question forward said that she was a displaced worker, and it's an incredibly stressful time for folks who are out of work to do what they need to do every day. And I feel bad trying to ask folks to do a little bit more, but if ever there was a time to weigh in with a senator about, how better to, how to meet this challenge, how to help farmers meet this immediate need, now's the time to do it.
And if we've had a few questions come in around a kind of similar subject, so I'm going to mush them all together if I can. Kind of twofold, I guess. So these are 2 questions. The first is, is there a way to connect people wherever they are? Where can people find more information on their area food hubs, to kind of shorten that supply chain? If they want to get involved, purchase from their food hub or otherwise get involved with their food hub. Is there a place that you can direct people to find more information about that?
Yeah, we actually, one of the things that we put together at NSAC is a list of state by state food hubs and local food production participants. And that's available on our website, which is sustainableagriculture.net. And if you go to that ever-evolving document, you'll see a bunch of folks in your state that are involved in providing for local and regional food systems. And you'll be able to hopefully find somebody in your community that you could buy from or that you could support directly. And we're not the only folks that are doing this. There are other folks. The Farmers Market Coalition has a comparable list of local farmers markets that are still operating that you could also go and visit.
Are there any training program, now everything's online, but if this is kind of local food, urban food hubs is something that people wanted to be trained in and really work in more, are there training programs for something like that? Are there videos or webinars or anything?
There, yes and no. It kind of depends on what you want to do. USDA is in the process of standing up an urban agriculture center to help urban and peri-urban producers. There aren't a lot of resources available yet, but there are some coming. I am happy to make a list available to you folks about, to everybody in the James Beard Foundation and on the webinar today, about where they might be able to go and find some resources to plug in, either to participate in a food system or to learn a little bit more about some of the challenges that everybody's facing right now.
Thank you. And Robert, I think, sent in a very good question, but I don't know if NSAC can speak to it, if you can speak to it, how these supply chain disruptions have impacted fishermen, fisherwomen, and fisheries that are in the United States.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And to be honest, NSAC does not have a lot of members who are engaged in fishing or aquaculture, but I will say that in my previous position, working for a senator from New York, and in the conversations that I've had with a lot of colleagues who remain on the Hill, this has been really terrible for the fishing industry. As you know, many of the products that are produced by domestic fishermen and fisherwomen and folks that are engaged in aquaculture are pretty high value products. And many of them are sold through restaurants and sort of more folks that are willing to pay a premium for domestically sourced fish and aquatic proteins. And those markets are gone. And so those folks are really struggling. And the value system or the value chain and the market infrastructure around fruits and vegetables is pretty complicated, but it pales in comparison to processing crabs or sort of that value chain. And so I know a lot of folks both in the Pacific Northwest and in the Northeast and in the Gulf Coast have really been suffering because folks don't eat seafood in their home in the same way that they eat seafood when they go out. And so there's a strong effort in Capitol Hill to make sure that those folks get included more significantly in subsequent aid packages. So it's not really something that NSAC works on a lot, but I do know that there's a lot of folks that are really advocating for that very strongly.
Great, and with just the few minutes we have remaining, what are your kind of parting thoughts, words of advice, insight for this group of people that have gathered here?
I don't have words of wisdom. I don't. I wish that I did. I will ask that everybody persevere. And I will ask that everybody be kind to themselves, be kind to each other, and to remember the challenges that you're seeing right now when we get to the other side of this, and to help that understanding and that knowledge inform how you run your business, and how you relate to the people around you. I know the folks at NSAC are doing that every day with each other, and we're trying to do that with our farmers and our food system workers. And yeah, just be kind to each other and be kind to yourself, and think about what things you see now that are challenges, and remember when we're on the other side to work to fix them.
I think those are very good words of advice. So thank you again for being here with us for this hour this afternoon.
Ashley, it was my pleasure, and I really appreciate both everybody's engagement today and the fact that so many folks are willing to give an hour of their time to come and listen to me prattle on about agriculture policy and be engaged. It's incredibly important, and it's really meaningful both for the folks that are working directly with farmers and for folks that are working in federal policy. So thank you for that.
And I shared out the website, sustainableagriculture.net. Are there any social media handles that people should be aware
of? So we lost our social media person at the beginning of this. So it'll be whatever I make up at the end of this, and I am not the social guy, so I will make sure that there is something appended to the notes. I'm sorry, I can't add anything right now.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So for the time being, if you want to learn more about NSAC and what they're doing and the work that they're doing and ways to support them, definitely go to sustainableagriculture.net. That is also in the chat box. I just wanted to thank you all again for joining us. This is our last webinar of the week. Again, next week, we are going to be focusing on reopening, since there's been a lot of questions on that. And again, you can find our webinar schedule. It'll be up tomorrow at jamesbeard.org. You can Google James Beard Industry Webinars. That's an easy way to find stuff too. And we'll have registration for those next week. This is recorded. All of our past webinars are recorded. So if you want to share this, review it, do whatever you want, or any of the past webinars, you can go to those same websites where you registered for this probably, which is, jamesbeard.org/industry-webinars, something like that. Just Google industry webinars. And so, yeah, we will see you again next week about reopening. And thank you again for spending your time with us. Have a good weekend.
Be safe, everyone.